They weren't just an army. They were a moving city. 200,000 men. The largest force Byzantium had assembled in 100 years. As they marched, the ground didn't just shake. It groaned under the weight of iron, leather, and pride. These were the masters of the Mediterranean, the Eastern Roman Empire. For 700 years, they had written history with the blood of their enemies. They held Syria. They held Palestine. They held Egypt. They held half the known world. And now, they were coming to take it all back. But they were terrified. Why? Because of one name, Khalid ibn al-Walid. To the Romans, he was a ghost. To his men, he was the sword of God. He was the general who never lost. Not once. He had already done the impossible. He had crushed the Persian Empire in the east. He had crossed deserts that were meant to be impassable. He had taken Damascus. Now, he was standing in their way with only 40,000 men. The Roman Emperor, Heraclius, sat in his palace in Constantinople. He wasn't a fool. He knew that numbers usually win wars. If you have 5 men for every one of the enemy, you don't fight a battle. You perform an execution. He sent everything. Every veteran. Every garrison. From the mountains of Armenia to the sands of Egypt, the Roman machine was emptied out into the Syrian desert. Their message was silent but deafening. This ends now. The two armies met at a place called Yarmouk. It was a high plateau in southern Syria. Wide open ground. To the Romans, it looked perfect. Their massive cavalry needed space to run. Their heavy infantry needed room to breathe. They looked at the horizon and saw 40,000 Muslims. They looked at their own lines and saw a sea of steel that stretched for miles. They brought their families. They brought their wives and children. They brought servants and gold. They weren't preparing for a fight. They were preparing for a victory parade. But Khalid was looking at something else. He wasn't looking at the 200,000 soldiers. He was looking at the ground behind them. He saw the Wadi al-Ruqqad, a ravine, a cliff, a 200-foot drop into a rocky grave. The Romans camped with their backs to it because they were confident. Why would they ever need to retreat? They had the numbers. They had the power. They had the history. Khalid didn't say a word. He just waited. He knew a secret that the Roman generals had forgotten. In war, the biggest armies are the hardest to control. A small, sharp knife can cut a giant if the giant trips over his own feet. And Khalid was about to make the giant trip. The stage was set. The sun was rising over August 15th, 636 AD. The world was about to change forever. Question: one massive army. One tiny trap. Why did Khalid smile? A. Food ran out. B. Massive panic stampede. C. Poisoned the water. D. Emperor would surrender. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights and more questions. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. August 15th, 636 AD. The sun rose like a red eye over the plateau. The Roman commander, Varun, looked at his lines. 200,000 men. A wall of iron. He gave the signal. The trumpets screamed. The Roman machine began to move. It wasn't a charge. It was a tide. Wave after wave of heavy infantry. Shields locked. Spears level. They moved toward Khalid's 40,000 men like a slow-motion landslide. Khalid's line was thin. Too thin. The collision was deafening. The sound of 200,000 men hitting 40,000 is the sound of a mountain breaking. The Muslims held, but only just. By sunset, the sand was red. Khalid had lost 3,000 men. In any other battle, that's a tragedy. Against this army, it was a miracle they were still standing. One of Khalid's commanders walked to his tent. His armor was cracked. His face was covered in dust and blood. "We can't do this for 6 days," he whispered. "They have too many. We have too few." Khalid didn't look up from his map. He looked at the Roman camp. He looked at the Wadi al-Ruqqad behind them. "We don't need to win today," Khalid said. "We just need to survive." Day 2. The Romans attacked harder. They were frustrated. How were 40,000 men still breathing? They threw their elite Armenian cavalry into the center. The Muslim line bent. It curved like a bow about to snap. Men were dying in heaps. Officers were screaming for reinforcements. But there were no reinforcements. Khalid had committed every single man to the front. He stood on a small hill, watching. He wasn't fighting. He was studying. He watched how the Roman generals gave orders. He watched the gap between their infantry and their horsemen. He watched how they rotated their tired troops. Most generals see a battle as a fight. Khalid saw it as a puzzle. Day 3. The pattern repeated. Roman attack. Muslim defense. Stalemate. The Romans were exhausted, but they were winning the war of attrition. For every Muslim who fell, there were 5 Romans to take his place. But something was changing. The Romans were getting angry. They were the masters of the world. Why wouldn't these desert dwellers just break? By day 4, Khalid did something strange. He pulled his center back. Just a few yards. The Romans cheered. "They are retreating," they screamed. They pushed forward, deeper into the trap. They committed more men to the middle, cramming themselves into a tight space. They were so focused on the retreat that they didn't notice their flanks were stretching thin. They were becoming a giant, clumsy weight. Day 5 was the breaking point. The Roman officers were arguing. 5 days of blood. 5 days of heat. 200,000 men were starting to smell like death. Varron, the Roman commander, made a choice. "Tomorrow, we end this. No more games. Every soldier, every horse. We throw everything at them." That night, Khalid gathered his men. He told them the plan for day 6. They looked at him like he was a madman. "That's suicide," someone whispered. Khalid just smiled. "I know." Question: why did Khalid pull his center back on day 4? A. To escape death. B. Cram Romans together. C. Running out of arrows. D. His horse died. August 20th, 636 AD. The morning of day 6. The air was thick with the smell of old blood and dry dust. This was the day the world would tilt. The Roman commander, Varron, stood at the front of his 200,000 men. He looked at the horizon. He didn't see an army. He saw a nuisance that had lasted 5 days too long. He drew his sword. The blade caught the morning sun. "For Rome," he roared. 200,000 voices roared back. The sound was like a physical blow. It traveled across the plateau, hitting the Muslim lines like a storm. The charge began. It wasn't a run. It was a rhythmic, terrifying stomp. Thousands of horses. Tens of thousands of heavy infantry. The ground didn't just shake, it groaned. Dust rose in a massive, choking cloud that blotted out the sun. This was the largest Roman attack in a century. A wall of steel and flesh moving at full speed. Khalid's 40,000 men braced their shields. They were exhausted. Their armor was dented. Their swords were notched. They looked at the incoming tide and they knew. This was the moment. Everything depended on the next 10 minutes. The collision was like an earthquake. Shields smashed into shields. Spears snapped like dry twigs. The Roman weight was absolute. It was physics. 200,000 against 40,000. Khalid's line began to bend. Then it began to crack. The Roman center pushed so hard that the Muslim ranks started to break apart. The Romans cheered. "They are breaking. The desert is ours." they shouted. They pushed harder, leaning into the fight, stepping over the bodies of their own men to get to the kill. But Khalid wasn't panicking. He was counting. He stood on his horse, eyes narrowed, watching the Roman formation. He wasn't looking at the fighting in the center. He was looking at the edges. He was looking at the rear. The Romans had committed everything. Every reserve unit, every veteran squad, every horseman. They were all pushing forward, hungry for the finish line. No one was watching the flanks. No one was looking behind them. Khalid raised his hand. High, in the hills, hidden for 6 days, 3,000 elite horsemen were waiting. They hadn't fought a single minute of the battle. They were fresh, they were fast, and they were lethal. At Khalid's signal, they emerged like ghosts from the dust. They didn't go for the center. They hit the Roman left flank like a spear through silk. At the exact same moment, another 3,000 horsemen hit the right flank. The Romans weren't ready. You cannot turn 200,000 men in a few seconds. It's like trying to turn a mountain. The flanks collapsed inward. The Romans in the rear started pulling back in confusion, but the ones in the front were still pushing forward. The giant army began to fold in on itself. Chaos erupted. Orders were swallowed by the screams of dying horses. And then, through the smoke, someone screamed the word that ends empires. Retreat. Question: why did Khalid keep 6,000 horsemen hidden for 5 days? A. They were cowards. B. For final flank. C. No more weapons. D. Waiting for rain. Retreat. The word spread like a plague. It started at the back, where the soldiers first felt the sting of Khalid's hidden cavalry. It ripped through the center, where men were already suffocating in the crush. 200,000 men heard it, and they did the only thing a panicked crowd can do. They turned. All of them. At the same time. But there was nowhere to go. The Romans had built their camp with their backs to the Wadi al-Ruqqad. They had trusted their numbers so much that they hadn't left an exit strategy. They thought the ravine was a wall that would protect them. Now, it was a trap that would consume them. The first line of retreating soldiers reached the edge of the cliff. They skidded to a halt. Their boots kicked loose stones into the dak, 200-foot drop. They looked down and saw nothing but jagged rocks and certain death. "Stop!" they screamed, throwing their hands up. "Go back. There is a cliff." But the 190,000 men behind them couldn't hear. They only saw the sword of God charging from the flanks. They only saw their brothers dying. They only saw the path to safety, which was straight ahead. The mass of humanity didn't slow down. It was a stampede. A wall of 100,000 tons of muscle and iron pushing forward. The men at the front were shoved. They clawed at the air. They grabbed the capes of the men next to them. It didn't matter. One by one, they went over the side. Then 10, then 100, then thousands. The sound was unlike anything heard in war. It wasn't the clash of steel. It was the sound of a waterfall of human beings. The ravine, Wadi al-Ruqqad, began to fill. Soldiers fell on top of soldiers. Horses plummeted through the air, crushing the men who had fallen seconds before. Some tried to climb down the slippery rocks, their fingers bleeding as they searched for a grip that didn't exist. They fell too. Khalid's cavalry reached the Roman rear. They didn't even need to use their swords anymore. They just rode forward in a line, like farmers herding cattle. They pushed the Roman army toward the brink. The choice was simple: die by the sword or jump into the abyss. Most chose to jump. For 3 hours, the Roman Empire fell off a cliff. Literally, 70,000 men vanished into that ravine. The screams from the bottom were muffled by the bodies piling on top. By the time the sun began to set, the Wadi al-Ruqqad was no longer a valley. It was a mass grave, leveled off by the sheer volume of the dead. 700 years of Roman pride, 700 years of military tradition, was being crushed under the weight of its own panic. Khalid stood at the edge, his silhouette dark against the orange sky. He didn't cheer. He didn't boast. He just watched the end of an era. Question: what turned the Roman protective wall into a death trap? A. Volcanic eruption. B. Unstoppable human momentum. C. Earthquake during battle. D. Bridge was sabotaged. The news reached ancient Constantinople like a cold wind from the desert. The messengers were ghosts, men covered in the dust of a fallen world, their eyes vacant with the memory of the ravine. They didn't bring reports of a tactical retreat. They brought the news of an extinction. Emperor Heraclius was in the middle of a meal when the first survivor reached his presence. The man collapsed. He didn't speak. He just wept. When the numbers finally came out, 70,000 in the ravine, 50,000 in the field, Heraclius didn't scream. He didn't execute the messenger. He simply sat down. The silence in the throne room was heavier than the weight of the Roman gold in the treasury. For 700 years, Rome had been the sun around which the world revolved. Syria was its jewel. Palestine was its heart. Egypt was its breadbasket. In 6 days, the sun had been extinguished. Heraclius knew the math of empire. You can lose a battle. You can even lose a province. But you cannot lose an entire generation of soldiers and expect to hold the gates. He ordered his court to pack. He walked to the edge of the city, looking out at the Syrian landscape one last time. The olive groves, the ancient roads, the cities that had been Roman since before his ancestors were born. "Farewell, Syria," he whispered. "What a beautiful land this is for the enemy." He wasn't just saying goodbye to a piece of land. He was saying goodbye to the dream of a united Roman world. He turned his back on the east and began the long journey back to Constantinople. Behind him, the doors were wide open. Khalid didn't waste time. He didn't wait for the dust to settle. While the Romans were mourning, the sword of God was moving. Damascus was secured. Jerusalem was next. Then Alexandria. The great cities of antiquity fell like dominoes. There was no one left to stop them. The Roman garrisons that remained were terrified. They had heard the stories of the Wadi al-Ruqqad. They had heard of the man who turned a cliff into a weapon. In less than a year, the map of the world was redrawn. The Middle East, once the bedrock of the Byzantine Empire, became the heart of the new Islamic Caliphate. It wasn't a temporary occupation. It was a permanent shift in the tectonic plates of history. The Romans would never return. The Persians were already gone. Khalid stood in the middle of this new world, a general who had achieved the impossible. He had broken 2 empires with a fraction of their strength. But as he looked at the maps, he knew his work wasn't finished. There were still those who doubted. There were still those who thought Yarmouk was a fluke. He was about to prove them wrong. One last time. Question: why did Emperor Heraclius say Syria was for the enemy? A. He hated Syria. B. Defenses were gone. C. Sold it cheaply. D. Preparing a trap. Khalid ibn al-Walid did not die on a battlefield. This is the most haunting part of his story. For a man who lived by the sword, who breathed the dust of 100 charges, and who sent empires over the edge of cliffs, the end was quiet. Too quiet. Years after Yarmouk, Khalid lay in a bed in Homs. He was no longer the commander of the armies. He had been retired by the Caliph, living out his final days as a private citizen. But his body was a map of his life. He pulled back his sleeves and looked at his skin. There was not a single spot on his torso or his legs that wasn't scarred. Spear wounds, sword cuts, arrow marks. He had spent his entire life looking for a glorious death in the thick of the fight. "I have sought martyrdom in 100 battles," he wept to a friend. "There is no place on my body without a scar. And yet, here I am, dying in my bed like an old camel." His friend looked at him and said something that would define Khalid's legacy forever. "You do not understand, Khalid. On the day of your first battle, the Prophet called you the sword of God. A sword of God cannot be broken by a man. If you had been killed by an enemy in battle, it would have meant that a human had broken God's sword. That is impossible." Khalid died in 642 AD. He left behind almost nothing but his horse, his armor, and his sword. He didn't build palaces. He didn't collect gold. He only collected victories. The world he left behind was unrecognizable. Because of those 6 days at Yarmouk, the Roman Empire was forced back into the shell of Turkey and Europe. The Persian Empire was a memory. The Middle East had begun its journey into Islamic history, a journey that continues to this day. One man, 40,000 soldiers, and a cliff had changed the destiny of billions of people. We still talk about him 1,400 years later because Khalid proved a terrifying truth about power. The biggest army isn't the one with the most men. It's the one with the most discipline. The smartest mind beats the largest crowd every single time. He didn't just win battles. He broke the psychological spirit of the ancient world. When you look at the ravine of Wadi al-Ruqqad today, it is quiet. The wind blows through the rocks where 70,000 Romans once met their end. There are no monuments there, only the silence of the desert. But if you listen closely to the pages of history, you can still hear the thunder of the horses. You can still hear the scream of retreat. And you can still see the shadow of the man who saw a cliff and knew exactly how to use it. The sword of God was never broken. It was simply put away. Question: why was it impossible for Khalid to die in battle? A. He wore magic armor. B. God's sword can't break. C. He never actually fought. D. Enemies were too scared. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.